Hey, Sleepy Sheepy here. Today we're going to be looking at a level 70 strength build using Ghiza's wheel. For this build, we'll be putting 40 points into vigor, 22 into endurance, 39 into strength, and then 13 into dexterity, but we will be using Millicent's prosthesis, which gives us an extra 5 so we can hit the 18 dexterity requirement for this weapon. Ghiza's wheel is fairly difficult to use at lower levels since it only gets a D-scaling in strength and a D-scaling in dexterity. For being a colossal weapon, it's honestly not so strong, but it is pretty fun to use and it has one of the most fun weapon arts in the game. So the armor we're going to wear is going to be the Tree Sentinel Helm, the Vagabond Knight Armor, the Vagabond Knight Gauntlets, and the Tree Sentinel Greaves. I've been running a lot of high poise builds, so I wanted to switch it up and use something with lower poise, so we'll be at 62 poise for this build, and we're going to be able to take advantage of the hyper armor that comes with this weapon to essentially poise trade with people, but we will need to be a little bit more careful to avoid stun locks throughout the course of our invasions. As for our talismans, we'll be using the Erdtree's Favor +2, Greatjar's Arsenal, Millicent's Prosthesis, and Claw Talisman. Because this weapon gets such poor scaling when it comes to strength, we're going to be using two tiers related to health bonuses. So we'll use the Crimson Burst tier to get HP back over time, as well as the Crimson Bubble tier. The moveset for this build is going to be overall very slow. It has decent range and a lot of hyper armor, but it is going to be very predictable. So light attacks come out slightly faster than they used to when this game came out, but they're still pretty slow. The running light attack is also fairly easy to dodge and is predictable. The running heavy I actually like because it's a little bit delayed, so we can kind of use that to our advantage. And the heavy attack is also pretty solid with the two-handed moveset, where it comes out in kind of a wide sweep, so we might be able to stun lock multiple opponents at the same time while using that. The reverse backstep is actually probably one of the best aspects of this moveset because it has a lot of forward momentum and comes out fairly quickly. The crouching attack, unlike the reverse backstep, which does have a decent amount of range to it, has very short range. So it's very fast, but suffers from just being a very short range moveset. So overall, this is not a great weapon, and I feel like the colossal weapons in general are a fairly difficult weapon class to use, especially if you're playing against passive players. But I definitely wanted to give this a try, and it does have one of the best Ashes of War in the game, which looks like this. In my opinion, this could use a little bit more hyper armor, but it's still pretty fun, and you can kind of mess around with it. That's everything that I wanted to say related to the moveset, the strategy, and the build. So if you have any questions about this, definitely feel free to let me know in the comments below. Also, if you wouldn't mind considering subscribing, I'd really appreciate it. But yeah, that's all I got, so let's go ahead and jump into the invasions. Alright, so jumping into our first invasion, we have a 2v1 in Castle Sol, and it starts out with some advantage because the Phantom is pretty low on health, and I'm able to grab just a jumping attack without them really knowing that I'm there. So that ends up working out very well at the beginning, and then I do go for another jumping attack as the player with the halberd starts poking me. And here I go for a hyper armor trade, which does deliver more damage than they do, so I went out on that trade. And here I land a nice free aim with the frost pot that prevents them from healing, and just in time I'm able to land another jumping attack. So I feel like that invasion was probably the best case scenario in terms of using this weapon, because almost every one of my hits connected, and they weren't able to heal in between any of them. So that's going to be kind of the ideal situation. Next up we have 2v1, and again I'm going for players with fairly low health, and that's going to be really useful at this invasion level. So I'm at level 70. It's fairly common to see players with low health, so that does kind of help make up for this weapon, but you can easily run a build with 40 vigor at level 70, so you can have enough health to really, tank 3 to 4 hits with this weapon. So here I'm able to get a quick guard break and post, and then go for the wake up with the spinning wheel Ash of War. And that was one of the few times I was able to actually get a kill with spinning wheel. It's not super useful, and the hyper armor isn't great for it, but when you do have an opportunity to go for it and you don't get stun locked out of the kind of attack animation there, then you may be in business. So narrow hallways are one of those places where it's a really good idea, and also if you notice somebody is fat rolling, you can oftentimes chase them down with spinning wheel. So next up we have a 3v1 in the Radahn boss fight kind of pre-area. And this involves a wizard as well as a host with dual curved swords and another phantom with just a melee setup. And none of these players have too much HP, so I'm pretty quickly able to land just a couple hits on the mage and turn it into a 2v1. And so, as I kind of mentioned earlier, the low vigor situation really going to be helpful for this build. I definitely encountered some higher vigor players, and that made this weapon fairly difficult to use. So I think on lower level builds, it's kind of a give and take, where if you encounter over-leveled phantoms, you're going to be in big trouble, but if you're playing against, co-oppers or even gankers like this situation that don't level their vigor too much, you might be alright. So I am able to get that second phantom down and then kind of begin the process of going after this dual curved swords player, and you can kind of see some of the struggles that come with a weapon that's this slow. I try to use a variety of the moveset, switch it between two-handed and one hand, and just get as much damage out as I can. This is a great weapon for Estus punishing just because it has range and a great jumping attack, especially with the Claw Talisman, so I am able to kind of finish that off. This next invasion is a 3v1, and this is kind of one where I felt like things went my way, but not in the ways I was expecting it to. So I'm getting hit by Stars of Ruin, and it's doing a ton of damage. There's a player with Bike Spear, which is going to be a pretty solid counter to my build, and I'm just not totally sure how this is going to work, so I try to lead everybody towards some traps and into the PvE. I go for a hit on the trap there, try to get the big column of flamed fire, and that is enough to take care of the host, and then I go for some hits on this phantom just before I despawn out of the world, but don't manage to get them. So that's going to be another thing that I want to recommend if you're using Ghiza's wheel, is just try to use everything at your disposal, because it's a difficult weapon to use for sure, and if you have a 3v1 you can kind of incorporate the environment, you're going to be in a better spot. So this next step is just a one-on-one, and this was another player using Ghiza's wheel, and here we both go for spinning wheel Ash of War and just have kind of a spinning wheel off, and I managed to hit them before. I didn't know they were going to go for that spinning wheel Ash of War. In hindsight, I wish that we had just kind of both gone in full health into that situation, but it was pretty funny nonetheless, so I wanted to include it. Next up we have a 2v1, although a blue does get summoned into this world in the course of this invasion, and I'm doing a decent amount of damage and just, taking close to 75% of their health with every hit, but landing the hits is always the kind of the trick with this weapon. And I'm able to get the phantom down pretty early, but this host here with kind of the casting spells is something to look out for. So a lot of their spells are hitting me for quite a bit of damage, so I want to up my damage output a little bit, so I get a Frostbite proc on the blue and have used the Exalted Flesh, which does boost your physical attack. So using Exalted Flesh on a build like this, where you're kind of hoping to just kind of minimize the number of hits that you need to land, is going to be useful. Here I go for a backstab. I don't get the grab animation in the iframes, which means that I end up in the Ash of War and taking some damage. And then here I almost get the kill with Spinning Wheel, and they have a little bit of HP left, but I do manage a just crouching attack, which takes care of the rest of their health. So that definitely worked out and was not so bad. So next up we have a 2v1, and I played these players earlier and lost to them, I feel like, pretty badly, so this was kind of like a rematch moment, and I was more determined to end up, winning this particular battle. The Phantom here, I think, was maybe slightly over-leveled, not crazily so, but definitely doing quite a bit of damage. So I do land a parry kind of early on and get the riposte damage, but as I'm trying to get away out of that situation, I do get hit with Bloody Slash. So keeping my HP up was definitely something important in this particular invasion, because the Radahn Helm user is definitely delivering a lot of damage with their Bloody Slash Ash of War. And I'm really kind of determined here to get the Phantom before attacking the host, but it's not extremely easy due to their weapon setup, so I do notice that they like the running L1s with their katanas, and I'm able to grab another parry there after getting the Frostbite proc, which means my riposte did more damage than it would have had I not thrown that Frost Pot. So that was really kind of instrumental in applying extra pressure, and here I kind of trade with taking the damage from Bloody Slash while also getting my attack out, which has just enough range to take care of the Phantom there. And here I want to show just one of the difficult things about Ghiza's Wheel is you can almost continuously guard break your opponent and just not have enough time to grab the riposte. So I do have enough stamina, but the recovery frames are so long on that particular animation that you need to kind of be right up in your opponent's face to grab the guard break riposte. So that happens so many times throughout the course of this, and I am dealing at least blood loss buildup, but I'm not dealing any damage because they're blocking 100% physical damage. So one of the reasons that this build is fairly difficult to use, and one of the kind of the challenges that I'm not sure if exactly I enjoyed, but it just made me more intentional about my playstyle. So eventually I do start trading with them a little bit. Their weapon is not doing a ton of damage, and there I'm not sure exactly what happened, why they didn't have their shield up and why they just kind of stood there, but I managed to get a little bit of extra range on that attack and get the kill. Next up we have a 2v1, and this is in kind of a poison swamp area, and I really enjoyed this particular fight because we had a person with a Zweihander, and then we had somebody with 2 great swords. So we all kind of had big slow weapons, and it was just kind of a battle of the slow weapons in a poison swamp area where we're just continuously rolling in the poison, which makes it kind of impractical to use boluses, especially when it's kind of close quarters. So I opted not to use any poison boluses throughout this particular invasion, and neither did anybody else, which kind of felt to me like it was going to be balanced. I just kind of figured I didn't really have much of a chance of getting, the poison down and keeping it off of me for the course of this invasion, and that ended up being an okay decision, I think. So here I managed to get a bunch of HP down just with multiple stun locks on my opponents, and I do throw some frost pots, and here the Phantom is almost dead, and I think they're kind of taunting me in to try to get me to be more aggressive, and there it does work, but I'm able to land a jumping attack with low HP because I don't think they were expecting me to play aggressively in that moment, and so I'm just able to come out a little bit faster than either of them and kill the Phantom and stun lock the host. So now it's just a one-on-one with the host, and they're going for a lot of jumping attacks. I was hoping to grab a backstab in that moment because the dual greatsword setup is pretty susceptible to backstabs, but I think, I'm not sure if it was just me or not, but it felt like it was a little bit harder to grab backstabs using a colossal weapon than some other weapons. It could totally be in my head, but if anybody knows if it is harder to grab the backstabs in PvP with colossal weapons versus something that's slightly faster, definitely let me know, because that is something I'm super interested in and kind of learning more about. So the fight kind of continues, and we get a lot of trades, and eventually the host starts going for a lot of Storm Stomp or Hoarfrost Stomp attacks, which I think are pretty decent. And there we have just a weird moment in terms of lag where it looks like I've stun locked my opponent, but they kind of teleport away. But that was kind of the only moment like that throughout the course of this invasion. And the Hoarfrost Stomp does set up kind of a nice opportunity for a jumping attack, but I wasn't able to quite land it on any of those, I don't think. So if I had reacted maybe a little bit quicker or just had a slightly faster weapon, I might have been able to land those. But the host is getting low on health. I have at one point started using my Mixed Physic, and the regen is kind of doing a nice job of canceling out some of the damage I'm taking from poison, but we both are taking a fair amount of damage over the course of this invasion, so that was just kind of an interesting aspect that I rather enjoyed. I don't usually just fight people that are willing to just kind of hang out in poison swamps, but it was interesting, and eventually I am able to land a couple attacks, and then I'm not sure if that was PvE or poison or what, but the host does have very low health and then go down to one of those two things. So next up we have a one-on-one, and this was kind of like the ideal situation where we have a Phantom that's pretty aggressive, and I'm able to stun lock them twice right before they go for their Ash of War. And the first is just a Frostbite proc with the Freezing Pot, which stun locks them out of their Ash of War, and then the next attack is the Ghiza's Wheel, which does get the extra bonus of damage because they are frostbitten. And then I'm able to very quickly chase down the host. So that was kind of one of the two experiences I had with this particular weapon, where I might be able to kill 2 or 3 low vigor players very quickly just because this has a fair amount of damage. I mean, it still has a descaling in strength, so I wouldn't mind seeing a little bit more at this particular level, but it was doable. Or I would end up in a very long fight involving passive players and would just kind of need to chip them gradually over time. So that's something more similar to the invasion in the Poison Swamp area, where everybody has a decent amount of health, and it's really just a chip battle damage, which I also enjoy. I think that's kind of a fun thing to do. You have to really vary your moveset and try to play unpredictably, and it's a pretty good time. So eventually I do end up with just the host here and go for some jumping attacks. I found jumping attacks to be pretty effective, especially the neutral jump where you just jump straight up and come straight back down. And for weapons that you can either poise through or that have very horizontal sweeps, it's a pretty good option. So this host isn't really healing, which is kind of odd. I go for a ravioli step and just kind of miss that, but do go for a neutral jump attack that ends up delivering the final blow there. This next one started out in a pretty funny way. So there, the player with Bolt of Grand Sacks just threw Bolt of Grand Sacks at me, and that animation knocked them off the ledge that they were on, and they ended up taking damage in the fall, which was a great way for this to start, in my opinion. And then here I go for a free aim that I was almost kind of amazed to actually hit, and it did knock the Bolt of Grand Sacks player out of their first animation, but they managed to hit me with the second one. So their whole play style is pretty much set up around going for the Ash of War with Bolt of Grand Sacks, so they spend most of their time kind of just running away, and if I get stuck in recovery frames for whatever attack I'm going for, they might go for Bolt of Grand Sacks. But you can see here just like what a frustrating weapon this is to chase down with. It's so slow. At a certain point I did just throw on a rapier as a hard swap. I didn't put any of those invasions in my showcase because honestly, like, once I had the rapier equipped, it was very hard to switch back to Ghiza's wheel, because by comparison, your fights are just going to go down so much more quickly and so much more easily when you have a weapon like thrusting sword. So I definitely kept this just to Ghiza's wheel and tried to be very true to the weapon and build here, but having something that's viable for chase downs like a thrusting sword, or even just any kind of medium class weapon, could be a straight sword or a curved sword, or just something that swings a little bit more quickly than this, is going to be a useful swap to use. So I didn't use it here, but if you wanted to make a Ghiza's wheel kind of your main build for all time, I think not having a hard swap would be pretty detrimental to your playstyle. So eventually I do manage to get the Phantom, and it becomes just a one-on-one with the host. And here I go for some backstep attacks, just kind of trying to mix things up. I managed to hit the player just one time with kind of a heavy attack, and then I do go for another heavy attack there. And just kind of the wide sweep that comes with the heavy, and kind of the backswing, having some active hitbox frames is really useful. I really enjoy the heavy attack on this, and almost wish that I used it more. So next up we have a 3v1, potentially a 4v1, because I kind of felt like I was battling the camera the entire time. But it starts off with a pretty quick kill, and that's one of the other issues with Ghiza's wheel, is that it takes up a fair bit of real estate on your screen, especially if you are in an area like caves. So it can be actually fairly difficult to see what your opponents are doing. I think if anybody played Dark Souls 3 and was familiar with like Leto's Great Hammer, they know what I'm talking about. But at least Ghiza's wheel is a little bit more narrow. It's not as wide as something like that weapon, but I kind of digress here. The 3v1 that has turned into a 2v1 is pretty tight of a spot, so I'm mostly just trying to use my hyper armor to get some kills in, and eventually I am able to kind of go for a jumping attack with some extra hyper armor to get that last player to just kind of go down. They weren't really managing their HP as well as they should have. I was really backed into a corner, so they could have taken their time a little bit, I think. And next we just kind of have some lightning attacks being thrown my way. I do manage to kind of trade with a lightning bolt with a freezing pot, and then I'm not sure what happens, but it seems like the host kind of gives up, and I'm able to just kind of land an attack there that finishes them off. Next up we have a 3v1, and this I'm not sure exactly if I'm proud of this, but it really showcases how susceptible you are to backstabs if you go for the jumping attack. Now, fortunately, I was playing against 3 players that had very, very low damage output, and because of that, I think I played a little bit more recklessly in this invasion, and I'm not sure if I necessarily recommend that, but it definitely does happen to me from time to time where I'll kind of just throw caution to the wind if I feel like I don't really have too much danger. So here I get backstabbed for the first time, and you can see just how little damage that wizard type player has done. They are using just an axe, and when the wizard did switch to their spells, they were doing quite a bit of damage, but they weren't optimized at all for doing any sort of melee damage, so I'm not sure why they were sticking to that particular axe. So just kind of an odd moment there, but really it wasn't incentivizing me not to go for jumping attacks, because the regen that I have going is making up for any damage I'm taking from those backstabs very quickly. So here you can see the wizard pulls out a couple spells, and I did get hit by one of those later, and just it did about a quarter of my health. So in comparison to the like maybe 30 damage that they're doing with their axe, I'm really not sure their choice, but you know, there I do get a 4th backstab. The slow weapon is just it does really leave you open to it, especially in group settings. So I was kind of surprised I didn't get backstabbed more throughout the course of my invasions. It's potentially the case that PvEers are not, you know, primed as much to go for critical attacks as, you know, PvPers, but it ended up being totally fine within the context of this invasion. I think the biggest issue that I was kind of needing to look out for was the blood loss buildup. So there you can see the mage goes for a spell and actually trades into it and does quite a bit of damage. So their approach to this invasion, I think, was not really correct. If they had just stood back and cast spells, I think they would have been in a much better spot. Here I do finally go for a Blood Bolus, and that gets me back down to 0, which is great, and I'm able to kind of begin the chase down on the Phantom here. And I go for a Ravioli Step, and they dodged it a little bit more easily than I hoped for. That Ravioli Step attack does have a very narrow hitbox, so that is kind of a downside to it. If it kind of comboed into a more sweeping attack like the 2-handed heavy, I think it would be by far the best attack available, but I do think it is kind of a nice way to balance that particular move to have the overhead slam. So eventually I do land an attack on the Phantom. Everybody is kind of going for lots of light attack chains, and here I go for the Spinning Wheel Ash of War. Almost die in the process due to blood loss buildup, but the Phantom is now pretty low, and I'm able to land just a jumping attack or kind of a falling attack on the Phantom. And then once it's just a one-on-one, I'm fairly easily able to just get a crouching attack and follow that up with a nice heavy attack. So that was something I did notice, was that you might be in a good spot to land a heavy attack as a roll catch off of the stun lock that you get initially. So I definitely liked going for either crouching attacks or light attacks, and then following them up with a slightly charged heavy attack. And I found that to be potentially a good way to roll catch. If they roll straight back and away from you, they're probably going to be fine and be kind of out of reach, but if they roll around you, you might catch them with the foreswing or the backswing of the heavy attack, and it can be really nice. So next up we have a 2v1, and really this is a 2v2 because there's an ant involved that's doing a decent amount of damage, but this player just like kind of screamed, I am a good candidate to die from Spinning Wheel. So I went for that Ash of War a couple of times. Just the fat rolling and the Radahn's Helm were just kind of clues that it might be possible to land such a silly Ash of War. So eventually, on the second try, I am able to land it. The first time was interrupted by that ant, so kind of an aggressive teammate to have, but it worked out in the end. So next up we have a 1v1, and I just really enjoyed kind of the pace of this fight, and it was almost like going on like a little bit of an adventure. So it's me kind of chasing this Eleonora Poleblade user down, and it kind of went through and across a lot of terrain, had a decent amount of PvE involved. They're rune-arced and light rolling, so kind of a difficult player to go after with Ghiza's wheel, but I am able to stun lock them fairly easily, so that is going to be something that works in my favor, and I'm also going to be able to hyper armor trade with something like two-handed Eleonora's Poleblade. So here they get some hits taken by PvE, and then here I think I make the right call of hitting them once on the way up, or at the top of the ladder, and then go for a falling attack that almost takes the rest of their health away, but they manage to kind of get away. And here they're in kind of a tough spot with PvE again, but do manage to get 2 quick heals in and start getting some of the Eleanor Pull Blade attacks off. There's a little bit of chaos with the PvE involved because they're like the marionette soldiers. They have a very strange rhythm to kind of how they attack people, where there'll be like a lot of burst damage and then they'll almost be stationary. So I just kind of thought that was fun in terms of how it contributed to the pacing of the fight, and also was very helpful because my weapon being so big and slow, had they not needed to worry about any PvE in the environment, then I think I would have had a harder time hitting them. But they also were fairly aggressive, which I appreciated as well, because if they had been more passive and light rolling, I really would have been in a bad spot. But here I can kind of go for some crouching attacks as they continue their attack chains on me, and there I almost get the kill, but they managed to get 1 more heal in. But I kind of delay my next hit, hoping that I can get an Estus punish, and there they do manage to get their Estus in scot-free. So that can be something that's a little bit difficult about the jumping attacks, especially on kind of like an incline, as you do have the potential to jump over your opponent. But here they really just stay aggressive, and I go for a running heavy right as they run out of Estus. So that was definitely a nice moment there, and just kind of a fun chase down. So next up, we do have kind of a variation on the build, and this was just something that I tried at the very end because I thought it was kind of fun, and I kind of wanted to see how the dual Ghiza's wheels would work out at this particular level. So to do that, you need to take off most of your armor. I took off everything but the helmet, which isn't really necessary, but I was able to just kind of run in and get a quick like Oonga Booga kill on the Phantom there, and then a couple hits on the host there. And here, you can see how much damage I take because I don't have any armor on. Again, I can go for just a jumping attack and get so much damage, at least for this particular level. And it's a lot of fun. It's not really like viable or honest within the context of, it's not necessarily dishonest, but it's not a very practical play style. So here we come back to the last invasion of the showcase, and this is going to be just kind of a microcosm of a lot of what I experienced. So if I was lucky enough to have a one-on-one with a Phantom that was, passive, so lucky in terms of not having to deal with 2 opponents at the same time, it looked a lot like this, where I would be dodging their attacks, they would frequently be dodging my attacks, and it was a slow kind of grinding fight that just made me feel like the weapon that I was using it just really made me itch for a heart swap. I really would want to, switch over to a thrusting sword, or just anything with kind of in the range of medium swing attacks rather than this weapon. Also, not having access to a practical Ash of War is not the biggest issue in the world, but it's going to take away a great mix-up opportunity you have and a great burst damage opportunity you have, which leaves you in kind of a tough spot where you have jumping attacks, critical attacks, and maybe heavy attacks. You're not really going to one-shot anybody with those, and I'm not necessarily saying you should, but it's just, with such a slow weapon, it's to not have Ashes of War is difficult. So, this ended up kind of being a long, slow, just kind of chip damage battle, and eventually, the host kind of got into the mix, and they were using dual daggers, which is very effective at chipping, especially when I'm kind of focusing in on the Phantom here. So it was like a bit of a struggle, and I had a lot of invasions that were fairly similar to this, where I spent a long time, kind of gradually chipping players, and sometimes in the end I would end up, managing to kill them all, or sometimes it was just like, you spend 10 minutes gradually chipping somebody, and then you get hit with Moonveil and a jumping attack simultaneously and die. So that was very much a part of my experience, and that kind of leads me into just my review of this weapon as a whole, and kind of something I wanted to say about colossal weapons. So for a colossal weapon with really bad scaling in strength and dexterity, as well as Ash of War that's pretty impractical. I mean, the wind-up for it is very slow, you're not able to move very quickly, and you don't really have too much hyper armor for the duration of it. So it's not useless exactly, but the risk to reward when it comes to using it is pretty it's pretty high risk, pretty low reward. Also, to kind of go along with that, it doesn't stack with successive attack bonuses. So Millicent's Prosthesis, Rotten Wing Sword Insignia, Thorny Cracked Tear, those three things don't contribute to the damage output that you're able to do with this particular Ash of War. Whereas if you look at like Mirai's Greatsword, you have something that's very similar in functionality, much faster and much more high damaging. And just kind of the whole moveset of Mirai's Greatsword feels like a much better version of Ghiza's wheel. The damage output on like jumping attacks might be lower, but you have a faster moveset, and you have this Ash of War that's extremely practical, has better range, better damage. And this is all kind of a long way of saying that I think that this particular weapon could use a buff. I don't think it ever will, because nobody's really like kind of paying attention to it and asking for buffs. Like the flail class as a whole could probably use buffs. Whether or not the entire class of colossal weapons could use a buff, and I'm excluding colossal swords from that kind of statement, I'm not exactly sure, but this weapon in particular felt like it was purely for memes and had like very little going for it. So that was, you know, it was fun to try, and it also really like taught me a lot about stamina management and whatnot. But overall, I wouldn't really recommend it as your main weapon, and I would love to see some changes to it in the future. As always, if you made it this far, I just wanted to say thanks so much for watching. I really appreciate everybody's support. And if you do have any recommendations for builds in the future, feel free to let me know. I always take a look at those and add them to a list that I have if I like the build that is suggested. So yeah, that's all I got, and I hope you have a good one.